Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
This past Tuesday saw a blue wave hit the Republican Party. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Well, Phil Murphy was expected to easily win the job in New Jersey for governor. Ralph Northam walloped Republican Ed Gillespie with a 9-point lead in Virginia. And the GOP's majority in the House of Delegates is now in danger. While Democrats are basking in the glow of victories, Republicans are sorting out what the results may mean. We first turn to Professor Stephen Farnsworth at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia, to take a look at the significance of the Democratic victories.
The results on Tuesday were a clear rebuke of Donald Trump. Any competitive suburban legislative district, in particular in Virginia, went Democratic. That demonstrated not only the problems of being associated with Trump, but the difficulty of any Republican in trying to navigate an electorate that is getting increasingly more critical of Trump's politics.
Were you surprised at the margin?
Ralph Northam won a large majority on Tuesday night in large measure because Ed Gillespie, who had traditionally been a more moderate Republican, decided to go all in on the question of immigration. From attack ads on immigration to a conversation about Confederate monuments, it was clear that Gillespie figured his best strategy towards victory was sounding a lot like Donald Trump. And the more he sounded like Donald Trump, the deeper his hole was, the larger the margin ended up being.
Because I know when we looked at the polls, we saw the race tighten particularly as Gillespie made this barrage of ads, particularly the MS-13. Was that just an illusion, or was the result just simply turnout?
Well, what you really see in this election was a much greater turnout among people who often don't turn out in the year after a presidential election. In Virginia, when you compare, say, a presidential year to a gubernatorial year a year later, you see a significant decline in the number of young people who vote, and you see a significant decline in the percentage of the electorate that is African American. What you saw instead in 2017 was a comparable level of African Americans and young people in the year later election, comparable to that of the presidential election. And so if those two Democratic loyalty groups show up in comparable numbers to the presidential year before, then you're looking at a situation that's very favorable to Democrats. And I think one of the things that the polls did not anticipate was how much the 2017 electorate would look like the 2016 electorate. I think a lot of people were thinking the 2017 electorate would look like the last gubernatorial election electorate 4 years ago.
So what do you think this means in terms of the Democratic Party and the lessons that they draw from it? I mean, because we have Northam, who's not necessarily a Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, and yet he led this campaign that ultimately won and looks like it got support of the party across the board.
I think the Democrats have learned that an argument based on competence and an argument that is based on presenting a moderate, likable figure is a strategy for success in a lot of places. I think that is the key lesson for the Democrats. The good news for the Democrats going forward is this may, in terms of the midterm election in 2018, the results in Virginia and elsewhere may convince some Republicans that it might not be worth it to run for another term in Congress, and it might convince other Republicans who are thinking about getting into a race against a Democratic incumbent to wait for a year that may be more favorable. Donald Trump has done the Republican Party a great disservice in the way that he has made it much more difficult for Republicans to win elections in Virginia and elsewhere.
Now, one of the things that also happened was it's sort of this blue wave that seemed to have hit the state legislature, the House in particular. Democrats at least coming in with something like 13 or 14 seats, just shy perhaps of taking control of the House of Delegates. What do we make of that, particularly with some Republicans who had been in office for a long time?
Yeah, there were a lot of Republican incumbents, particularly in suburban areas around Hampton Roads, around Richmond, and particularly around the D.C. area in Prince William County, who were defeated by Democratic challengers, many of them women, many of them making their first campaign for office. The lesson here for the Democrats, it seems to me, is that it makes sense to run candidates even in places where you don't think your prospects are all that good. There were a number of Democratic victories on Tuesday in places where Democrats often had not run top-tier challengers historically. And the result of Tuesday, I think, convinces a lot of people that the strategy of running a lot of Democrats across the board, even in places that are not particularly friendly, may be the more successful strategy.
Do you think that the wins that we saw with the Democrats in the House of Delegates, do you think that's a more permanent thing, or do you think we're going to see a wave and then perhaps that recedes, say, in the next 4 years?
Well, I think it's important to remember that there are no permanent majorities and no permanent minorities in American politics. I think that right now you're looking at an environment which is very unfavorable for Republicans because people are very unhappy with Donald Trump. His approval rating in Virginia consistently is in the 40% or lower range. That's not going to be a good environment for a Republican to run in a day in which people are not focusing as much on Donald Trump. The Republicans are likely to do better. But for the moment, for the foreseeable future, for the next 3 years or so, Donald Trump will be part of the conversation. And the way things stand right now, that's not a good thing for Republican candidates.
What do you think, by the way, this does in terms of redistricting for the state of Virginia?
Well, the Democrats now have the opportunity, at a minimum, to veto any redistricting plan after the 2020 census. The Ralph Northam governorship starts in January and lasts until 2022. That means that any Republican plan, even if the Republicans keep the House of Delegates, means it has to go through a Democratic governor. And that gives a great deal more authority to Democrats than they've had historically in terms of the redistricting. The Republicans controlled the House of Delegates redistricting after the 2000 census and after the 2010 census, and they created big majorities for the Republican Party because of that. They won't be able to do this next time.
By the way, I need to ask you about the transgender candidate who won, Danica Rome. Was that, I assume, unexpected and ousted somebody who, A, had been there a long time, and B, touted himself as being homophobic?
Yeah, I think when you look at the individual races, and Danica Rome is one of those, you see a very effective strategy for having a conversation based on policy issues. Rome did not run as a cause candidate with respect to transgender issues. Rome ran as a candidate focusing on those concerns that were likely to motivate swing voters, issues of transportation, economic development, the kind of community that people live in. And that, I think, is a good strategy for candidates who are looking to win over those voters who are not reflexively going to vote for the Democrats or reflexively vote for the Republicans.
Turning to the Republican side, what lessons do you think this takes for the Republicans?
Well, I think it creates a very difficult environment for the Republicans in the short term. Donald Trump is not helpful. And the challenge, I think, for Republicans is how to deal with that unpleasant reality. On the one hand, you don't want to offend those Trump supporters who you are going to need to win a general election, but at the same time, embracing Trump really has its own problems in terms of creating a backlash among more moderate voters, including some moderate Republicans who didn't like Trump. That reality of the challenge of trying to thread the needle is going to be with the Republicans for a while.
Because one of the things I noticed, for instance, the president, after Gillespie's loss, basically said that he hadn't really identified with his issues, that didn't really identify with Trump. And we've had, on the right, we've had Breitbart calling Gillespie a Republican swamp thing. Laura Ingraham, the cable host, talking about how Gillespie was trying to play footsie with the conservatives. I mean, there seems to be a backlash by the conservative element of the Republican Party and the conservative movement.
Well, there's an old saying in politics that defeat is an orphan, and now no one wants to claim parentage of the Gillespie campaign. But anybody who was watching the television ads for this Virginia gubernatorial election knows that Gillespie offered up a very Trump-like message at the end, talking about immigration, talking about Confederate statues, all the hot-button issues that Trump himself has emphasized with respect to his own campaign in the first year of his presidency. So it doesn't seem to me that any reasonable analysis of the Gillespie campaign would suggest that he didn't take on the Trump message.
Does this mean, in effect, that you can't have Trumpism without Trump?
Well, I think that in the short term, it's simply an unfavorable environment for Republicans. When you're looking at a president in under 40% nationally, other than those deep red states, that's going to be a net negative for you as a Republican candidate. There's no good way to get around it. Gillespie tried to thread this needle. He did not appear at a public rally with Trump, but there were Trump robocalls to loyal Republicans. He didn't take on the Trump message at first, but he took it on at the end. And so as he tried to thread that needle, it's clear that there was a pretty powerful backlash, even with the way that he tried to connect with Trump.
Looking ahead, does this mean that we're going to see perhaps a coming civil war within the GOP?
Well, I think the question for Republicans in the short term in Virginia is about the Senate nominee for next year. In 2018, Senator Tim Kaine, the incumbent Democrat, is going to be facing a Republican. The main name that is being talked about right now is Corey Stewart, who offers a much more Trump vision of the Republican Party. And he may very well be the Republican nominee, in large part because the most capable Republicans who might have thought about running for the Senate in 2018 may be looking at the results of 2017 and saying, you know what, this is not an opportune time to run for office. And so Kaine may very well face Stewart, or if he doesn't face Stewart, he's likely not to face a top-tier Republican candidate who would look at the playing field for 2018 and decide there's got to be a better year than that for a Republican candidate to take on an incumbent.
So do you think that there will be some Republicans who will look at this election result and begin to think maybe I don't want to stay as incumbents, that maybe it's time to get out?
I think that the impact of Tuesday's results in Virginia and other places around the country create two potential short-term problems for Republicans. One is the one that we just talked about, the issue of candidate recruitment. Will the Republicans be able to field their A-team in terms of challengers for Democrats who are now in office? The second problem is the retention, the issue of Republicans who represent swing districts in Congress thinking it may be hard to win a re-election, they may not have another election fight in them, or they may not wish to deal with a Republican primary where they may face a Tea Party challenger. So I think this is a significant problem for the Republicans nationally, candidate recruitment, candidate retention as well. And so you're looking at a very difficult environment for the Republicans in 2018 when it comes to the House of Representatives. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a number of senior Republicans in the coming weeks decide that 2018 is the year they will not be on the ballot.
Do you think there's a potential for the Democrats to actually take the House?
I do. I think that the prospects for a Democratic victory in the majority in the House of Representatives is better a better prospect now for the party than it was for them a year ago or even a day ago. I think that Donald Trump has not shown a real ability to pivot away from the kind of divisive issues that have made being a Republican a very difficult prospect in Virginia and elsewhere.
Funny, it does seem to me that we had earlier elections in which the Republicans eked out either victories in heavily Republican districts. And when Republicans looked at that, they said, we're safe. It seems to me that those elections and the closeness, particularly in those districts, they were kind of the canary in the coal mine that you should have expected something like this in Virginia and beyond, simply because those races were really close.
Yeah, I think that the Republicans have had a pattern of underperformance in strong Republican districts in those special elections leading up to the results on Tuesday. But what's important and what's different about Tuesday is now we're talking about statewide elections. The New Jersey governor's race featured a Democrat who won in a walk. That had been a Republican governor, Chris Christie, in office. In Virginia, the performance of Ralph Northam was not only better than Terry McAuliffe when he ran for governor 4 years ago, Northam also won a greater percentage of the vote than Hillary Clinton did a year ago. So this is a sense that that Donald Trump, the president, is more damaging to Republican candidates than Donald Trump, the candidate, was, and that is bad news for Republicans, and it's good news for Democrats who are thinking about the House of Representatives.
Professor Stephen Farnsworth at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. We now turn to Salisbury University political science professor Michael Laughlin. So what do you make of the election, particularly as we sort of step back from the Virginia-specific implications?
Well, I agree with the professor that basically two factors brought about the victory in Virginia that are probably in play then nationally, and that's the clear demographic shifts that are taking place that continue to favor Democrats. Again, the movement towards a majority-minority electorate. That is an accumulation over the course of time. And then the other factor is an anti-Trump. This was clearly an anti-Trump vote. I believe the exit polls indicated that some 30% of those who voted cited that they were voting against Donald Trump, whereas only, I think, 15% were voting in favor of Donald Trump. And I think that is going to be a national phenomenon. The old notion essentially is that victory spawns greater momentum, essentially. And so Democrats come out of this particularly the Virginia scenario with some momentum going forward into the 2018 election.
Let me ask you this, and something that occurs to me is that we've seen past positions when it comes to the Republican Party, whether it's immigration, it's even the Muslims and the ban and so on, although they didn't advocate a ban. Do you think that one of the things that's happened is that Donald Trump has now personified these trends within the Republican Party, that before they were kind of diffuse because there were just lots of people, but now you've got an actual single figure that people can focus on?
Unquestionably, Trump now is the face of the Republican Party, and I think that he has successfly Trumpified the Republican base, and so that there's the influence. I mean, we always tend to think that leaders reflect the constituencies, but there's it goes the other way as well, that leaders shape the consciousness and the ideological orientation of a constituency. And we do have a Trump constituency that's very hardcore. And again, for Republicans, in one sense, Republicans have ridden that tiger, and now they're getting eaten by that tiger. And that tiger being this base that at the present time has a consciousness that is rancorous, that is there's a bigotry there, there's a racism there that Trump has helped to generate, and that Republicans now are caught in. They have to appeal to those people to mobilize them because they need that to win elections. But when they do, as Gillespie did in Virginia, it bit back essentially. It mobilized the Democratic constituency base in much greater numbers, and I think that is the kind of dynamic that is going to follow through certainly the 2018 election.
By the way, do you see a connection between what we're seeing now in terms of the election last year, the opposition to Hillary Clinton Democrats, and going for Trump? Do you see a connection between that and, say, the emergence of the Tea Party, which was in 2010, another kind of conservative political jolt that seems to, at least, if maybe not even policy-wise necessarily, but certainly there seems to be some of this energy that seems to have spun off. I mean, because although we didn't see a reaction, say in the midterm elections, right? Whether it's 2010, obviously that was their election. From the next midterm election, 2014, we didn't see a big pushback to that movement.
I mean, I think this is certainly what Steve Bannon is attempting to do. In other words, I think that the Tea Party movement had some punch and continues to have punch within the Freedom Caucus, let's say, in the House of Representatives. But Bannon is attempting to generate a Tea Party-like movement. But it's unclear whether that will be as successful. I mean, again, we don't want to read too much into the Virginia case, but it is an interesting case in the sense that the intensity, the participatory intensity of that kind of coalition that Bannon is attempting to harness didn't help Gillespie. It didn't come forward to get to sweep Gillespie into office. The other side was able to mobilize much more successfully. So whether or not the Bannon effort is going to be successful, the next test, of course, will be in the 2018 election. So in one sense, I think that the Tea Party movement is a more successful. Has more,
certainly, yeah.
And it's unclear yet whether this other movement it will have that kind of success.
Because one of the things that Bannon has placed his money on is the concept of nationalism. Certainly, economic nationalism. There's a certain ethnic nationalism that seems to go with it, even though I know that Bannon sort of denies some of that. And we've seen some of that reflected even, in Europe. We've seen some very nationalistic political parties arise there. Has he simply misread this in terms of what the future looks like? Because that's what he's bet on. I mean, he said that this is a turning point and so on.
I think he has. I think that the way I put it is it may be, and this is perhaps far too much speculation, but we like to speculate.
That's what we do anyway.
That's what we do anyway, is that, I mean, the dynamic, again, I do believe that the demography is destiny. I mean, I think there's a real foundational truth about that in terms of just what the picture of the electorate is going to look like in the next 5-10 years. We may look back at this period as, in effect, the last gasp of the old white guy, because Bannon is attempting to. He's a nativist, and clearly he's really trying to harness this a white nativist working class kind of movement, and that's a shrinking proportion of the overall population. And also that the policy prescriptions that Bannon and Trump are offering do not address, right, the economic woes and grievances of the very constituency that they're trying to harness.
Such as?
Well, they need a minimum wage increase is what those people need. They need income increase. And Trump and Bannon do not favor that. In fact, Trump and Bannon are favoring a tax cut that is going to be benefiting the wealthy classes, not the lower middle class, working class people that they're pitching these cultural wedge issues towards. Again, the immigration questions and the race card and the like. And when those people when their situations are not addressed successfully, they're going to look for others. They're going to look around again, as they did in the 2016 election.
Well, if you look at some of the polls, Trump voters, particularly in the Republican Party, they're still hanging with him. It's the Republican establishment that's not letting him do the things that he needs to do, that he's promised to do. They're still hanging in there to say we're going to give him a chance.
That's certainly what Bannon and Trump are hoping will stay in place. But I think over the course of time, there will be a further erosion of that constituency. And that's not to say that you won't have a rump constituency, but it's going to be small. And it's going to be smaller in proportion, particularly to the larger electorate that's evolving.
The other thing that struck me, cannot pass without mentioning the guy down in Alabama who is now embroiled in a sex scandal, and we have also somebody else that Bannon's backed who has tax problems in New York and so on. Bannon essentially has said, "I'm going to field candidates that are really solid candidates, as opposed to some of the folks, for instance, we saw in 2010 under the Tea Party." Christine O'Donnell is probably one of the classic ones who were completely unprepared to run. What do you make of that? But the fact that the Republicans in general seem to be caught in that, but that Bannon seemed to pick the wrong horse here. Whether or not he gets elected, I don't know.
It certainly shows a poor judgment on Bannon's part, in the sense that what kind of vetting what kind of vetting system does Bannon have, if any, in this respect, in terms of the background? Because clearly, more now the scandal is not only threatening to Moore, but it's even going to be even more threatening to the Republican Party if Moore actually gets elected. The Republican Party, then the spectacle spreads, and it was fascinating how with the the incompetency coming forward here, and the chaos really, because the Republicans want to focus on taxes, they want to push through this tax plan, and here comes yet another scandal that occupies the news and may have an effect on that whole plan to pass a tax plan. And moving forward, it's interesting. Bannon, his effort here in this particular case, is to deny the facts. He seems to want to say it's all the Washington Post dropping the dime on this guy, and clearly the Washington Post is wrong about this. But we don't have to investigate the facts. We'll just say that. If we say that often enough, we'll have sufficient people believing that, and they'll elect Judge Moore and other candidates as well. So, and I think, in one sense, Bannon is living in his own world. I think the reality of the politics is going to marginalize him.
So, what do you think Democrats should take away as lessons from these elections? And one of the things that struck me was that, despite whatever divisions that seem to exist between, say, the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and the establishment, whatever they might be, that seemed to disappear in this vote, even though this vote was preceded by Donna Brazile talking about how the DNC had put the thumb on the scale in terms of Bernie Sanders himself. None of that seemed to matter. They just turned out and they voted for Ralph Northam, who's hardly a Sanders kind of candidate.
Yes, precisely. I think that the internal conflicts that are within the Democratic Party, and they are significant. I think it's one way to conceptualize what goes on in the Democratic Party is you really have essentially the corporate liberal wing of the party, the more establishment Hillary Clinton-like folks, the Northams, really. And then you have this emerging progressive wing of the Sanders. The Sanders phenomenon is powered by a emerging progressive constituency. And these two groups, they have significant differences in terms of particularly policy matters. But on the social issues, on the cultural issues, on those, I think there is much more harmony. And what I think we saw in the Virginia case is putting aside basically the policy, economic issues in particular, embracing, harmonizing with these other issues, and that helped to mobilize Democrats to come out and vote for, in this particular case. That is likely, I think, to continue probably into the 2018 election, although I think come the 2020, the presidential election again, the kinds of issues, the economic issues that have divided the corporate liberals from the progressives, I think that's where there's going to be some friction, some trouble. Again, I don't think it is as significant as the fracturing that's taken place within the Republican Party, but I think it is not going to necessarily be easy sailing at that point in time. Being anti-Trump at this point in time is essentially the wind at your back. And that's going to power again the 2018 case. But But the Democrats, I think, would make a serious mistake if they would simply assume that that's what they can ride on in 2020 as well.
Do you think there's a correlation or an analogy between the kind of anger that we rose out of two Tea Parties movement and so on against, say, Obama as a personification of whatever it is that he didn't like, as opposed, and now we turn around, we have liberals and progressives who now have somebody they can focus on, which obviously is Donald Trump. In fact, I think it was Sarah Silverman, the comedian, who said that she now understood how people who hated Obama felt, because she feels now the same way.
Yes, sure. It's and being well, it is. I mean, I think it is easier to be against certain leaders and certain policy positions than it is to have significant agreement about promoting a policy agenda. But for us, the public, we need policy. We need good policy. So and again, part of the alienation, I think, that the electorate has felt over the years is that the seesaw with partisanship is there, promising, but real policy solutions to our problems are not necessarily forthcoming, and so the being anti-Trump again is powerful, but a policy agenda from the Democrats has to be forthcoming if they're to be fully successful, I think.
We've been speaking with Salisbury University political science professor Michael Laughlin, of course, about the election results on Tuesday, both in Virginia and New Jersey. Appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
My pleasure. Thanks.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.